mostly to bring people to your attention, you being my audience, whom I think you should know. And today is that's as true as it can be. I have in the studio someone whose name reminded me of a Dr. Seuss book. I have to get this out of the way. When I was at Yale in Calhoun College, one of my best friends was Adam Liptak. He's now the chief correspondent for the New York Times to the Supreme Court. And his girlfriend at the time, and now his wife, Jennifer Bittman, for some reason would always talk about this Dr. Seuss book. She would say, well, my favorite book is Marvin K. Mooney, Will You Please Go Now? And that stuck in my head over the years. Thank you, Jennifer. And when my guest was introduced to me, I said, what does this name remind me of? My guest today is named Margarita Mooney. And Margarita Mooney has never had such a dumb introduction, but I wanted to give her the dumbest introduction because our conversation is going to be the antithesis of this dumb introduction. Margarita Mooney, welcome.
Thank you.
You've never heard of that Dr. Seuss book? It rhymes with your name, Marvin K. Mooney, Will You Please Go Now?
My father is from New York City, Irish. That's where the Mooney comes from. But my mother is from Cuba. So I grew up with Spanish language children's books and songs. And it's true. I actually missed a lot of American children's activities because I was raised in the Hispanic children's
You were not obliged
culture.
to answer my dumb question seriously. You're such a brilliant, serious woman. I had to start out with something really
Not really.
dumb. But Marvin K. Mooney, Will You Please Go Now? It's one of these great books, and it sort of rhymes. And when I read your name, I was like, what does that remind me of? Let's just sweep that aside. You were introduced to go back to my friends Adam Liptak and Jennifer Bittman Liptak. There's a friend, a mutual friend of all of ours in Calhoun College named Bernadine Connolly, who is now Bernadine Clark. And she emailed me and said, you should have this woman on your show. And I looked you up, and it was one of those things I thought, how is it possible I didn't know you existed? Because we have so many points in common that I could not wait to get you on here. So thank you for making the trip from Princeton, New Jersey, where you are an associate professor. I want to get your background, but we're going to talk about a lot of things, folks, a lot of really, really important things. But if somebody says to you, Margarita, what is it that you do in 30 seconds? How do you possibly respond to something like that?
Well, I would say that I'm a writer and a professor and a mentor, but I'm really a person who's curious about all big questions and ideas, and I'm passionate about helping people go as deep as they possibly can into philosophical and theological questions to do things in the world, but ultimately to become the best free person that God made them to be.
Well, that's pretty good. But your experiences are so eclectic that's why I have to start out with a goofy introduction, because I know I like you from what I have read about you. I'm so impressed, but it's hard to sum up. You're a champion of freedom. You've experienced, Cuban Marxist totalitarianism. You lived there. You went to the Ivy League. We were in the same residential college at Yale, separated by a decade. Calhoun, you've experienced what you call and others call, the soft oppression, the soft Marxism of places like the Ivy League. So we have a lot of points of contact. You're a woman of Christian faith. So it is hard to know where to start. Maybe we should just start with your story. Can we
Sure.
do that so people can get to know you a little bit?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Frederick, Maryland. I have 3 older brothers. I grew up with my mother, who had come to the United States from Cuba in her 20s, married my father, who she met at Catholic University when she beat him in chess, in the chess club. He went off to serve in Vietnam and was in Vietnam when my oldest brother was born. And so my earliest memories of growing up in Frederick, Maryland was that I had a very safe and loving home environment, but we deeply cared about what was going on in the world in the 1980s, and we deeply feared the spread of communism throughout the world. And as a young woman, I really looked up to Saint Joan of Arc, the warrior saint from France, right? I wanted to use all the knowledge and power and strength I had and fight with boys. I had 3 older brothers, so I loved fighting with boys. And when I got to Yale, it was just like a dream come true. I felt like the world had opened to me, because that's what this world values, right? The prestige of an Ivy League degree. And I was in Davenport College as an undergrad. I later returned to Calhoun College when I was on the faculty at Yale. But it was really when in my junior year at Yale, I'd say my life changed because I visited Cuba for the first time. It was 1994. And I'll never forget taking a rickety plane from Cancun, Mexico, into Havana, pitch dark at night. It was the period of the worst economic crisis Cuba had ever seen. But everywhere I turned, I saw people, not just people materially deprived of things, which I had seen in other trips to Latin America, but people whose very hearts had been squashed by a totalitarianism that told them that they don't matter. What matters is some kind of political revolution that's going to create a whole new world that's then going to free people through solidarity, but in the meantime, oppresses every person in it. The craziest thing happened my first night in Havana that I'll never forget. The phone rang in my hotel room. There were no payphones anywhere in Cuba. This person was inside my hotel. It was a male prostitute who, in very explicit, disgusting detail, tried to sell me his services. I hung up the phone, I threw the plastic furniture in front of my door, and I just asked God to help me. And what I saw there was symbolic of what had happened to the people in Cuba, that they were reduced to such a low level of self-esteem that they were willing to sell their bodies to a stranger to simply have access to something that I would have given that man for free. And I thought to myself, how lucky am I that my mother left? And I was raised as a woman to respect my body, to use my mind to further myself, to be able to start something, to be an entrepreneur, and to know how to get up from failure. And to be in a country that deprived people of these very, very basic human rights, and that had really denied the existence of God entirely. Spending time with people who had been persecuted, tortured. Some of these people who I met on later trips to Cuba also moved me because they had forgiven their oppressors. And what I see now, which makes me very worried for our country, is that people are returning to this language of, we're not supposed to forgive those who have harmed us. This is not what Christianity teaches, and this is not what has made any political or social system ever work. Unforgiveness is something that continues to spread hate, and it preys on the worst of us. Now, do I believe in justice for people who've done wrong? Well, of course I do. That's why we have a legal system. That's why we have a moral system. But my heart has been moved by people who have suffered horrific injustices, violence, rape, torture, and they have forgiven their oppressors.
I mean, this is staggering stuff. And again, we're going to be going all over the place because, when I read about you, I realized we have so much in common. My mother grew up in communist East Germany. My father grew up in Greece during the communist civil war. They trained me, as many immigrants to this country, to hate communism, to understand what freedom is, to love freedom. Obviously, my Christian faith comes into this. When we come back, we are talking to Margarita Mooney. I'm really excited, folks. Don't go away. Hey, folks, I'm talking to Margarita Mooney. I love your name, Margarita. It just has this kind of like rhyming thing that suggests that Dr. Seuss thing, so you're going to have to forgive me for that. We're talking about many different things. We're talking about Christian faith and forgiveness. We're talking about the oppression of communism. But you're telling your story, because I always love to get people's stories, your biography of growing up in America, having a mother who's Cuban, so you have a connection to the reality of that horror going on near our shores. Why, when you are at Yale University, do you choose to visit Cuba. And what were you studying at Yale at that time?
Right. I majored in psychology at Yale. I also took a lot of history and literature classes, but I was really interested in knowing something about my own heritage. It's kind of strange to grow up with a mother who's from a country that doesn't let her return and doesn't let her children travel. Again, we focus on U.S. restrictions to travel to Cuba. What people don't realize is that Cuba is one of the few countries that doesn't let its own people back in once they've left, right? So I could never see this place where my mother was from. It was just stories, right? Good stories, but also tragic stories of when she left. And I just, one day in Mexico, while on a service trip, saw that there was a tourist trip to Cuba and went. And then I kept going back through a variety of means. I would cover up my identity. I would pretend not to speak Spanish. I would pretend I was Mexican or from Spain or something. Or, well, actually, I would pretend I don't speak Spanish when I go through customs so I could smuggle things in. I smuggled mostly magazines, religious articles, DVDs. All those things were banned, right? So access to information, not necessarily religious information. Some of it was. Some of it was just magazines, DVDs, music of Cuban artists who had the guts to defect, and then you couldn't listen to them anymore. And I'd bring back their CDs. So that experience of fear, actually going through customs and pretending not to speak the language and understanding and being searched, made me feel, just for a moment, the kind of intimidation that people feel constantly. But it really wasn't until after I graduated from Yale, I worked for 3 years in Central America with a foundation that was working on the peace process in Central America. So I also spent months going to former battlefields in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, meeting combatants on both sides of basically what had been these Cold War battles that played out in Central America. And that really shook me because I saw up close the human and the material destruction of all-out civil war throughout Central America.
I just have to ask you, because we have similar backgrounds, when I went to Yale, for me it was the American dream, right? Being raised by working class European immigrants and getting to go to Yale. And I didn't really figure out while I was there. After I graduated, I kind of figured out that it had been an ideological indoctrination. While I was there, I kind of went along with it, and it was only 4 years afterward that I had this epiphany. I became a Christian, and suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, what had happened to me in the course of going through a place like Yale. Was that awakening for you something that happened during your time at Yale, where you began to see the horror of communism and what I think you call the soft totalitarianism in the Ivy League today? Or was that something that happened afterward?
That came afterward. I'd say my senior year at Yale, I was already beginning to ask these questions because I had been to Cuba. But after spending 3 years working in Central America and going to these war-torn parts of Central America, then I enrolled in Princeton in a sociology PhD. And I was surprised and disheartened that the basis of social theory still was somehow Marxist, when Marxism hadn't worked in Cuba. Left and right had fought these terrible battles in Central America, and I felt we needed to change the conversation. And it was difficult to do because the default answer was, well, we can't solve the problems of poverty in Latin America until we get rid of bourgeois capitalism. And I said, well, but the 20th century was marked by revolutions that tried to get rid of bourgeois capitalism, and where they did, in Cuba, they put a worse form of totalitarianism in place. So can't we broaden the conversation here? And the answer I would get would be really narrow-minded. Now, I made some inroads, and this is actually what really changed me, was I started on my own. I'd always been Catholic, I had always gone to Mass, but I didn't really know the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I learned the Catholic intellectual tradition through one of the greatest pastors and saints of the 20th century, John Paul II. I was inspired by his living witness. And because I was inspired by what he did in his life to fight communism, I wanted to understand what were the thoughts and the ideas that motivated this great man. The same with Mother Teresa. I began to study Mother Teresa. Why? Because Mother Teresa served the poor and the dying. And having been in these battlefields in Central America and having been in the living rooms of people who were on the wrong side of the government in Cuba, I was often scared to go into the darkness and to stay. And I realized it was people like Mother Teresa who went into the worst possible regions and brought light that were actually doing something. So I thought, hey, you know, these people are some of the greatest living heroes today. Let's study their thought. And then I would get answers like, well, Mother Teresa doesn't really help the poor because she doesn't promote reproductive rights for women. Or John Paul II, we can't really admire him because he doesn't believe in the ordination of women to the Catholic priesthood. And I thought, look, you can have your disagreements with them, but even if you disagree with them on those points, can't you concede that they're actually doing the kind of heroic work that you'd like to see done? And can't you work with them? And can't you respect what's good about their thinking? And it was this sense that certain people were just beyond the pale because of certain views. And I thought that that was wrong.
You know why you did that? Because it is wrong. In the beginning of the program, you've already mentioned three of my heroes, Joan of Arc, JP2, and Mother Teresa. In fact, I wrote a book called Seven Men and a book called Seven Women, and the three of them are featured in there because these are heroes. And when you look at what John Paul II did, for example, isn't it extraordinary that a man who helped take down communism, one of the most wicked things in the history of man, certainly to take it down, to some extent, that he's vilified, as you say, for what? For having traditional Catholic views. That's the Pope's supposed to do that, by the way, nota bene for the current Pope. But I just have to say that that's what you face in academia. And I wanted to start there because you were talking about having experienced the world of the academy in a way that most people haven't. You are in the academy now at Princeton. You're at the seminary, theological seminary.
That's
right?
correct.
And talk a little bit about that. Did you call it soft totalitarianism? Something like that. You used a phrase like that you've experienced there, and why it is that way. What has happened to universities?
Well, first, let me say that there's a lot of good going on in the universities. There's still a lot of good going on in places like Yale and Princeton. I'm grateful for the time I've spent there, almost 20 years of my life. I have been able to write and publish about the things that I care about.
Right.
But I've also seen a shift. In particular, I'd say even in the last 5 years, it's gotten worse. I think the wake-up call for me, because I had been able, as I said, to publish and write, a couple of things happened. One, I was denied tenure at the University of North Carolina after spending 6 years there. And what got me wasn't that people had critiques about my work. What got me was that people lodged a critique at the last moment that I wasn't allowed to respond to, which was that my work wasn't actually social science because I dared to write that there's a reality that can't be measured through empirical methods, and that people have experiences of the supernatural that can't be fully explained through material or even psychological. Now, I realize some people don't agree with me there, but this is not a crazy philosophical stance to have. In fact, it's the philosophical stance of most of history and most people today. So I just said to the people who use that as an excuse to deny me tenure, I said it to their face. I wish you would just say that in public, and let's have a public debate about what it means to do social science. And let's have a public debate about the human person and really ask, is the human person purely material? Let's go ahead. Let's just have it out in the open. Don't do this behind my back in a way that's costing me my job. But then I calmed down and I wrote my own ticket to go back to my alma mater at Yale, right? When I got over my anger, I pursued my dream. I called my contacts at Yale. I had my research grants. I was working on a research grant on human suffering.
I'm going to hit pause. Folks, forgive me for that, Margarita Mooney. We'll be right back to continue that sentence. Don't go away. Hey there, folks. I'm continuing my conversation with Margarita Mooney, PhD, Executive Director of the Scala Foundation. That's Scala. Do we pronounce it Scala or Scala?
I say Scala, but
You say Scala? I say Scalia. Okay. If people want to find you, where do they find you?
my homepage is margaritamooney.com. You can find my articles, interviews, etc.
MargaritaMooney.com.
You can find me on Facebook. My public Facebook profile will also list my upcoming speaking events and new publications and videos.
Now I want you to finish. You were crafting a marvelous and important sentence, and I had to cut you off. Let's go back.
Well, when I was denied tenure at the University of North Carolina, I had just embarked on a research project where I was arguing that we couldn't really understand human resilience in the face of adversity if we didn't think about the human person as being fundamentally motivated by supernatural questions and searching. So when I was denied tenure, I was upset, but I was also adamant that my research and teaching would continue. So I got an opportunity to move back to my alma mater of Yale to continue my research grant. But my dream was really to move into one of Yale's residential colleges where I had been a student and just make my life more centered around student community. So I got an apartment in Calhoun College, and I opened up the doors of my apartment, basically doing a reading club in my apartment called the Calhoun Happiness Project, reading Gretchen Rubin's book, The Happiness Project. I thought I would get 5 students. I got 25, and they kept coming back. And guess what? They were not happy. They were miserable. And I began to ask, how is it that these kids can be so high functioning, yet so devoid of purpose and meaning and friendships? And although I was upset and didn't know where my career was going, I just threw myself into the community life of what college is supposed to be. And in working with students in those 2 or 3 years that I was there, we also then began this process whereby Yale announced it was going to think about whether or not to change the name of John C. Calhoun College because John C. Calhoun was a proponent of slavery. I attended these discussions, open, engaging debate about really important questions about the historical legacy of slavery. But when things got a little crazy in the Silliman courtyard with students charging and screaming at Nicholas Christakis.
You're talking about the Christakis. So this is like, what, 5 years ago?
It was 2015, 2014
so 4
or 15?
years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. Christakis was the dean in Silliman.
Yes, that's correct.
And I will never forget this because that's when I realized that things had gone, the barrel had gone over the waterfall when I saw the expression of vile hatred that was countenanced by the administration of Yale University toward a dean who was trying to be conciliatory. It was a magnificent and horrific moment in American academic history. But you were there then.
I was there.
So what happened?
The Christakis event has been reported about a lot, but the brief thing that happened was that in response to a move by the Yale administration to encourage students not to wear certain types of Halloween costumes that could be considered offensive, Nicholas Christakis' wife sent an email to a group of students saying that she thought it would be better for students to negotiate amongst themselves what's considered an appropriate behavior rather than have a list be sent out by a centralized group. This got her accused of supporting hatred on campus, and when Nicholas Christakis tried to defend her and have a rational dialogue, students began to charge him with all kinds of names and expletives and all sorts of things, demanding an apology. What he wanted was to have a civil discourse and a dialogue around difference. But when the students felt offended by his words, that was the end of dialogue. What they needed was an apology.
Okay, this reminds me, from what I know, of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. When I think of the most, I use the word advisedly, demonic manifestations of totalitarianism, of groupthink. When I saw the video of this arrogant young woman speaking this way to a dean and the students surrounding them, I thought to myself, this is the antithesis of American freedom. This is the antithesis of the values that have made the West great. And you were there at that time.
Well, I can tell you things that were not being reported in the media because I lived there. I lived with students. Do you know what that attack on Christakis did to civil dialogue among students? You would go into the dining hall, and no student wanted to critique the students who were doing those things, not openly.
Of course.
I was an editor of the Yale Daily News. I challenged the Yale Daily News editors about their terrible coverage of the events, and they said the reason the coverage was so bad, you know why? They were kicked out of a public event. I'm like, well, you should have reported that you were told to leave. So the Yale Daily News was afraid of critiquing the students. So what the students who were charging harm somehow couldn't see was that their actions were having a silencing effect on other students.
Well,
and Eric, I've
say
seen
that,
this.
but the point is, you know that that's what they wanted. In other words, this is, whether they know it entirely consciously or not, that's precisely the issue, is that people are afraid of the truth. They're afraid of genuine argument and civil discourse because they're afraid that they probably will lose, and so they use fascist tactics to shut people down. It's happening in the culture, and it's happening at places like Yale. We'll be right back, folks. I'm talking to Margarita Mooney. You can go to margaritamooney.com. I hope you will. He's right here. Margarita Mooney, let's just keep going. I was ranting at the end there about how people on the radical left today, they've gone beyond the pale. They want to shut down dissent. It's nothing less than fascist. It is usually shy of violence, but only usually. You were in the middle of this, so let's go back. I mean, there you were at Yale when the Christakases, who are not, they're not even conservatives or outspoken Christians. They're simply old-fashioned liberals who believe in the idea of diverse conversations, and they were told, shut up, you offend me, you're despicable. And the administration at Yale let the students get away with that. That's, to me, the horror, is that the administration let that happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I think needs to be discussed and understood, and what the students that I was working with at Yale at the time and continue to work with at Princeton and through Scala Foundation, where I work with students from all over the country, is that the totalitarianism that students feel is not one where they're formally deprived of the right to speak or the right to express their opinion. It's exercised through this emotional, psychological sense that you don't want to be accused of offending somebody or hurting somebody's feelings.
Right.
So that's why it can be called a soft form of totalitarianism. And students are very susceptible to this. It could be because of the pressure of social media, what they do to students on social media who dare to differ in their opinions. Again, they're not being formally deprived of their rights to speak or their right to start their own association, all these constitutional liberties.
To be humiliated in that way? I mean, look, in Germany in the 30s, before the laws were in place, the cultural, social pressure was there. If you said the wrong thing or didn't say the right thing or didn't say Heil Hitler loudly enough, you could lose a job or you would lose an association. And this is what happens before the laws are put in place, and the laws couldn't be put in place until this other stuff happened. And this stuff is happening now in America.
Well, what I tell students, again, having spent time in a communist country, what I tell students is you have a lot of freedoms and you need to use them. And if you don't use them, they can take them from you even quicker. And what are some of those freedoms? Write your own articles, start your own publication, start your own association. Heck, that's what I did. I started my own association. I started a 501c3 nonprofit. Anybody can do that.
And it's called?
Scala Foundation.
Okay, so if people want to look at that, what's the website?
ScalaFoundation.org.
Scala Foundation.
We're also on
That's
Facebook.
SCALA, ScalaFoundation.org. What you're talking about, though, Margarita, is courage. And you have been inspired by heroes like some that you've named, and you are now in turn inspiring young people. And you're saying what I say a lot. We have freedom we better use it, because while we still have it, we can use it. If we don't use it, we lose it. And many people, because of, you know, the cocked eyebrow, the social ostracization, they're afraid to do it. So you really
Look,
are
I
taking
also
a stand
talk to
against
students,
that fear.
As I mentioned, John Paul II. Another woman saint who I admire is Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein. She was a philosophy professor in Germany, a convert to Catholicism, and then killed at Auschwitz for being Jewish. She was willing to go to the death for her beliefs. But I tell students, you're probably not going to die the kind of murder of Auschwitz, but look at the heroes of the 20th century who were willing to pay the price for speaking the truth as they see it. And if you think your Ivy League education is going to prevent you from having to pay a price for speaking the truth, you're wrong. Take it. Be courageous. And if they get you, fight back with everything you have. And I think but do that in a way that's loving, do that in a way that's compassionate, even to the people who are persecuting you, right? Did St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross go to her death at Auschwitz wishing evil on her persecutors? I don't think so. And are you willing to do that, to be courageous and to love the people who disagree with you? So we have living examples of people who stood up to totalitarianism. Find your inspiration in those people, but your conscience is going to sleep better at night if you are speaking the truth. And if you give in to the pressure to keep your beliefs to yourself or to withhold what your judgments are about what's right and wrong and true and good, you're going to be eaten alive inside of yourself. And that's no way to live.
I would just guess, listening to you, that you would have to have already been labeled a number of awful things by the people who disagree with you, or have you been able to be under the radar enough that somehow you can function? I mean, you're functioning, but it just seems to me that people would want to shut you down by calling you all kinds of names.
I have had, I'd say, a few times when people have said things that I thought were unjust or unfair. I tend not to want to have my identity be centered on responding to critiques of who I am or what I write. I try to consistently present a message that's based on sound philosophical reasoning, true human experience, make rational arguments, and I try not to pay too much attention to the detractors. Now, that's much easier now that I have a tenured position, but I also try to lead from example. I don't think you lead by responding to your critics all the time. I lead by the example. Look at how I teach. Look at what I write. If people want to call me names, they can call me names. I publish my articles. I publish my syllabi. What I say is out there, and I believe that the heart of human persons has been given by God with the capacity to see the truth, and I believe that the truth will always come to the forefront, and my critics will always be there, and they might get more even critical than they have been in the past, but I believe that the human heart is made to seek and know the truth, and as long as I'm putting goodness and truth out there, the light is going to shine and the light is going to win.
Wow. Cut and print. That is such a beautiful, such an eloquent way of stating some of the most fundamental and important things we're dealing with now in the culture. And at the heart of everything you say, inevitably, is your Christian faith. I want to talk more about that when we come back. We've got lots more with Margarita Mooney. Go to margaritamooney.com. Why wouldn't you? Hey, folks, I'm talking to Margarita Mooney, PhD, and here she is. Margarita, it really is such a joy for me to meet you and to talk to you. We've just got a few minutes left in this hour, but you are talking about a stance in the culture that involves loving your enemies, forgiving those who've hurt you, not just you, but the people that have been persecuted under totalitarian regimes in places like Cuba and things like that. So it's inescapable, at least as far as I read it, that the Bible and what the Bible teaches about the human person is necessary to function in a thriving way.
Absolutely. I think all of the greatest inventions of our civilization are rooted on this radical idea that comes from the Judeo idea of the Christian person, that yes, we have good and evil within us, but we have a God who loves us and enters into a covenant with us and comes seeking us to give us salvation. Now, as a Christian, people who raise Christian take that for granted, but that is a message of light, and it is a message of hope. And to me, what Christianity brings to our broken culture today is precisely this message of hope. I don't have biological children. I admire Edith Stein because of her idea of spiritual motherhood as a professor, so I love my students like they're my own children. And one of my most beloved students ever died of cancer at the age of 26 here in New York City. And at his eulogy that I gave at St. Patrick's Cathedral in May, I spoke about the meaning of Christian hope in the face of suffering and death. And I'm speaking to high-achieving people from all kinds of backgrounds who are grappling with a young life coming to an end in its prime. But what Christianity teaches us is that death is not the end. And for those of us who are still on this earth, myself having survived 2 major car accidents, sometimes this life feels like a gift and also an exile when you've suffered loss. Christianity, I think, also teaches us that we are created as a person who has an existence into eternity, and that eternity can become present now. And that helps us understand the paradox that this life can be suffering and joy at the same time, and that we have to hold on to our highest aspirations for freedom even when it seems like things are being taken from us, because the victory has already been won.
Are you sure that you have tenure?
I believe firmly we need to be certain about rational things, and it is rationally provable and true and in contract that I have tenure.
No, don't dignify my stupid joke questions with such brilliant answers. Everything you have just said is so beautiful and so countercultural, and particularly countercultural in the academy. And so it's so vital to me that you are a voice speaking these things. We're coming to the end of our first hour, but if people want to find your talks and this beautiful speech to which you alluded at St. Patrick's, this eulogy, where would they go?
My talks are you can find links to everything on margaritamooney.com, and that might take you to my SoundCloud page or to my YouTube channel. Also subscribe to my Facebook profile, and I'll be putting new talks up there.
And I'll link to your stuff on my Facebook page and Twitter and all those places, because I really do think it's important that people out there listening to this discover you, because there's so much that you have to offer, and we can only get to a little bit here. But that's the end of our first hour. Folks, stick around. There will be more. Hey, folks, that's the Hughes Corporation, and I'm Eric Metaxas. This is the Eric Metaxas Show, and I get to have on anybody I want. And today, it is Margarita Mooney. I'm so happy to have you, Margarita, to continue the conversation. I'm looking through your resume, your what do they call it now?
CV, curriculum
vitae was the phrase I was looking for. And you've written articles. You wrote an article. I mean, you're everywhere and eclectic and polymathic. You wrote something for Scientific American, Engineering, Beauty, and a Longing for the Infinite. That's the kind of writing I can get behind, and I'm really just thrilled to have you here. I want to talk about the Scala Foundation that you started a little while ago. What is that?
Scala Foundation is a nonprofit organization I started because I believe in the value of a liberal arts education founded on a Christian anthropology that sees the human person as both the means and the end of education, right? The idea of liberal education is education for freedom, for people made for freedom.
Yeah.
Now, the article you referenced in Scientific American is one of many activities that have come out of Scala, right? That liberal education also applies to the sciences and to engineering. Because ultimately, if you look at the biography of scientists or meet with great inventors like we did on the trip that I talk about, we met with an inventor named Lino Dainese, a scientist inventor in Italy who's invented airbags for motorcycles that blow up when you fall.
Airbags for motorcycles?
Yeah. Right?
That's That's actually, once you hear something like that, you go, well, of course.
Yeah.
But I'd never heard of that
Well,
before.
and he described to the students, right? I mean, it was like meeting a modern day Michelangelo. And he described to the students where his inspirations came from studying nature, from studying animals, but also how really the greatest scientific inventions are simply, they're both technologically sound, but they also point our hearts towards the infinite. That's what he was saying. And it was like being in the presence of a master, right? So even if you look at all the greatest scientific innovations, like my friend Carlo Lanciolotti, who's a scientist, has argued, people like Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist in the world, were driven by this creative imagination and intuition. So the idea that science, that the world is rational and ordered, has to be met with the creativity of the human person.
Okay, that is a big statement. I have talked about this in different ways, sometimes more obliquely, but it's a big issue because there are scientists today who are scientistic. They're not scientific, they're scientistic. They've made an idol of science, and they say that there is no knowledge that we can get outside of scientific inquiry, which is patent nonsense. Everybody throughout history has known that there's more to the world than what we can find with our senses or with the scientific method. Everyone knows that science has limits. Science can't tell us why. And, when you're talking to scientists who get that, it's a rare and a beautiful thing, even for a scientist to talk about the longing for the infinite or for meeting the infinite, even the idea of what is beauty. Do we have souls? Do we long for something beyond this world? And does that, as C.S. Lewis said, imply that maybe there is something beyond space and time? These are really important questions, but in the university today, they seem to really strongly shy away from asking those questions, but you don't.
No, I don't. And I think one of the problems in the university, which is described so well by John Henry Newman, who was recently canonized, is that the temptation for academics who know a lot about one subject is to then interpret all of reality through the lens of one field.
Right.
The scientific method is about empirical observation and testing and understanding the material world. That's wonderful. When the scientific method becomes a pseudo-philosophy of the immaterial realities out there, it's crossed a boundary, and it's asking questions that the scientific method cannot answer.
Well, but there's an irony. In other words, they're being decidedly unscientific in doing so.
Of course they are. And when you point that out, some of them recognize it. So what I say to students is that if you want to build a motorcycle that works, you should listen to people who understand motorcycles. And if you want to talk about beauty and truth and goodness in the human soul, you should listen to 2,000 years of wisdom that has been preserved and tested and thought about. And so you need to take the time to study and to think and to engage with the tradition around these questions and not dilettante around important questions of who we are as human beings any more than you want your medical doctor or motorcycle engineer to dilettante with these products that could save you or kill you.
It's interesting because this is what ideologues do. Freud did it. I mean, when we won't even go into the nonsense of most of what he claimed to know, but when he talked about religion, you realize that it's very intellectually sloppy, and that people seem to have a freedom that they shouldn't in thinking that the world beyond the material is utterly subjective. We know that that can't really be true, that if there is something beyond the material, that has an objectivity and a reality that is simply different than this reality.
What the Christian tradition claims, which can certainly be debated, is that there is a fundamental uncreated essence that we call God, which has given to reality its very being, right? You could argue that all of material reality came from another material reality, but then at some point you have to ask, where did that material reality come from, right? So at some point, if it's purely material, you can't go back beyond a certain original point, right? And the classical philosophers, I mean, people long before there was Christianity, people believed that it's possible for an immaterial being to give created order its very being and its very sustenance, right? This is not a crazy thing to believe. There's well thought out theories in cosmology about this. But what's happened now, and what's really characteristic of the modern world, is that all of our reasoning must begin with the material reality being something we can control and manipulate, rather than something that's been given to us, that has been created. Now, that may sound like I'm just playing around with words. No. This is an extremely significant change in thinking in the modern world. Because when I take my students through Scala to monasteries that have preserved these traditions of wisdom and learning, monasteries are very grounded in material reality. They're farmers, they build things, they make things, but they see material reality through a classical understanding as both having rational, ordered, intrinsic principles, which modern day scientists want to affirm, but also being gifts of a creator that actually teach us about what that eternal reality is. So when we're riding on a motorcycle at 350 kilometers and wearing an airbag that explodes, we're not only experiencing a feat of engineering, we're experiencing a feat of the human soul that's longing for the infinite. And that's what the inventor told us. And as a Christian, the answer is that longing for the infinite is fulfilled through this eternal relationship with a creator God with whom we will rejoice in all eternity.
I can't help but think of G.K. Chesterton as you're talking. I assume he's someone whose work you're familiar with.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it was he or someone else who said that a human being is a walking poem. I've tried to look up the quote. I can't find it. I, for some reason, associate it with him. But the idea that we can be reduced to the material is, as I say, patently absurd. Most people know that that's not true. And even the people who claim it do not and cannot live as though that were true. We know that there's something more to us than, atoms.
You know what really gets me, Eric, is again, with all the close work that I do with students, if they've not been raised in a home that teaches them that they're created in love, when they hear these ideas that there's nothing more to us than our material reality, and they're struggling with the everyday problems of youth, identity, depression, mental illness, why shouldn't they conclude that their life is meaningless? And I had a conversation with an atheist student at Yale precisely on this, who really wondered, why should she go on fighting her suicidal tendencies?
Well, and that's the question.
And I said to her, look, you may not be a person of faith, but I am. And what gives your life meaning is that God created you in love. And I believe that you might struggle with mental illness for your whole life, but you will come to feel that love.
I want to, when we come back, I want to talk about your work with mental illness and that issue. It's very important, something I've struggled with to some extent. Folks, I'm talking to Margarita Mooney. The website is margaritamooney.com, and it's scalafoundation.org, and we'll be right back. I got to tell you, I'm having a fun conversation with Margarita Mooney, whom you can find at margaritamooney.com. Margarita, we were talking about so many different things. We're talking about materialism, the meaning of life. You were talking about something. I bring this up all the time in my speeches, that if you really believe that we evolved through random mutations by accident out of the primordial soup, and that life is genuinely meaningless, no one can live that way. And if you dare to even begin to try, suicide is the most natural option, or a kind of hedonism that is, vile, like Marquis de Sade kind of hedonism that's evil. People don't want to talk about this because it's easier to avoid. But you do talk about this.
Sure.
Kind of thing.
Well, look, I'll never forget through one of my research projects sitting and interviewing somebody who had just relapsed on heroin. When you've been abusing drugs for on and off for 10 years and relapsing, and your only philosophy of life is that the human person is the result of random mutations and survival of the fittest, why not conclude that you're one of the ones who shouldn't survive? What gives that person's life meaning?
Exactly.
Not his heroin addiction. And he needed, and what I find it's astounding, this guy had never set foot inside of a church, but he said very clearly, if there's anything good in me, it's got to come from something outside of me. But he couldn't give up on the idea, that's what kept him going, was that there was some kind of unbounded essence that could still reach in and save him, right? He was looking for a savior. Because if not, he should just give in to his addiction and let himself die. And I've also seen this with elite students who aren't abusing drugs, but are just struggling with identity, with community, with friendship, with love. And why shouldn't they conclude that they're just not one of the fittest, even though they're in the Ivy League, right? Because in the Ivy League, there's always 18 million more things you could be achieving. So a lot of them feel like they're pretty low on the rung. And why should they conclude that they're really an Übermenschen and not a decadent loser, and the earth would be better off without them? Why shouldn't they conclude that that's actually true?
That is utterly logical, and that is the horror of it, that we're not asking these questions. Because if you think about it, I've often said that the point of education for millennia was to answer, or at least to ask with wisdom, these very questions. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? Does life have meaning? Is there a God? Can I know God? What might God be like? All of these questions are precisely the questions that today are assiduously avoided by the academic world, because they have concluded that there are, in fact, no good answers, and that the best we can do is to distract ourselves, because to really look at it, to stare into this horrible abyss of meaninglessness, is your only option if you begin to get serious about asking these questions. But you and I say, no, there are great answers to these questions, so let's talk about it.
Well, listen, when I was at Yale working on my research project with young adults, I took a sample of young adults from a national survey who had experienced trauma. I went to 10 states and 26 communities, and specifically did not sample people who said they were religious or believed in God. And I talked to people who had abused drugs, who had been suicidal, who had been sexually abused. And it was astounding to me how outside of the halls of the Ivy League, precisely person after person had felt through their struggles that there must be some uncreated reality that sustains me, because if not, how do you explain the night that I threw myself down on the bathroom floor with razor blades and some force outside of me stopped me? And I pushed her on it during the interview several times. How do you know that wasn't just you? And she gave me a good answer, because I come from a family with a lot of people with mental illness. And she said, no. When every single bone in your body is telling you that you want to die, and something stops you. Like, I get it that maybe my neurons started firing in a different way because I cried so hard, but that doesn't explain that feeling of warmth that came over me and told me my life had a meaning, and I'll never forget it. No matter what happens to me, that moment changed my life, and it's why I'm still alive.
Well, at what point do we have to take the evidence of these stories that people tell? In other words, if you were in a court of law, this is not in a lab, but in a court of law, you listen to testimonies. And if somebody tells a story, you have to weigh, is this person crazy? Is this person a liar? Can they be trusted? But it seems to me that the welter of evidence for something beyond this world through stories like the one that you just told and things that I've experienced personally and innumerable people that I know have experienced has to count not just for something, but for a lot. And that's the kind of thing that the Academy, as I say, has tended to avoid. I don't know if you're familiar with Craig Keener's 2-volume work on miracles, but there very few people are dealing with these things in an academic way. And I think it's high time that they do. It seems that you're beginning to.
I'm certainly beginning to. I mean, I think that the danger in academia is that we want to filter what we're allowed to talk about in human experience through these materialist, atheistic lenses. I even heard a famous philosopher say, well, yeah, I've had experiences of joy, but since that goes against my materialist philosophy, there's no point in thinking about it. What I want to say is, hey, let's think about human experience in its totality. And if people are having these experiences, what is that telling us about our philosophy?
We're going to hit pause again. We'll be right back with Margarita Mooney. Stick around. Margarita, you're all over social media. You're on Twitter. You're obviously on Facebook. There's a zillion videos out there. I want to ask you, you mentioned that you're working on a book. You don't have a publisher yet, but can you tell us a little bit about the book? Because I'm excited to think that you're working on the book that you described to me.
Yes. Well, the book is both an intellectual and a spiritual memoir, and it's a research memoir based on interviews I did with young adults who have experienced trauma. But I share these stories of experiences of miraculous moments of transcendence and try to bring it into dialogue with where we are in our popular culture and why I think that Christian ideas of hope and grace actually help explain what a lot of people who may themselves not call themselves believers or may not call themselves Christians are actually experiencing. So the book is tentatively entitled Diving into Transcendence, Reflections on Grace in a Materialistic World. And I chose that title because, as we were talking about a moment ago, some kind of materialism is really the de facto philosophical viewpoint of how we treat people who have suffered trauma, right? That we want to reduce everything they're experiencing to simply a biological misfiring in their brain that we call mental illness. That may be occurring, but people are also asking spiritual questions. And people who have mental illness are still asking questions about who is God and what's my purpose in life. And those are spiritual questions. Heroin addicts also are capable of experiencing God, even in the midst of their tremendous suffering. And that's actually where I think we can help save them, is by seeing that they have a humanity that is bigger than their addiction. All the social science and biology on addiction and social, environmental factors, all that may tell us something important. But someone who's addicted to drugs needs to know that they have a soul. And that soul is capable of being redeemed, regardless of whether or not this particular medication is going to help them. Medication doesn't save people. It might treat an illness, but people are looking for something to save them. And I share as well kind of how hearing these stories sparked my own memories of family members who've struggled with mental illness. I share how, as the result of talking to someone who had been an alcoholic and almost lost his girlfriend, he ended up marrying her, that I actually reached out to someone who I had dated 20 years earlier, who I was afraid was going to become an alcoholic after his mother died. It turns out, God bless him, he did not become an alcoholic, but his brother did. Right? And so kind of, why do two brothers who go through the same trauma, and one of them goes on to be a happily married man with 3 wonderful children, and the other one succumbs to the family disease of alcoholism? And Eric, there's no good answer for that. And what I said to that man that I had dated, I said, you know what? If your kids ever start abusing drugs or alcohol the way that you once did and that your brother does, the most important thing you need to do is love them no matter what, because what saves people who've abused drugs and alcohol is believing that somebody out there loves them and is going to be there for them. And do you know how many people don't have that? And a lot of students at Yale and Princeton don't have that.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that I interviewed in my project, the worst thing in the world, I believe, Eric, is to go through life not having experienced unconditional love. And so many people don't get it at home, and they're not taught that there's a God who loves them unconditionally. Now, unconditional love doesn't mean you don't have standards or discipline or make judgments.
Yeah, obviously.
But simply that you are loved in a traditional sense of emotion, but also pulling you towards your best version of yourself. And people want to be loved in a way that's challenging them to live up to higher ideals.
I mean, I would argue that's what love is, right?
Of course.
I mean,
of
you
course
can't,
it is.
when we talk about unconditional love, as you just said, you have to qualify it. You have to explain it because it's not sloppy, mushy. I mean, Bonhoeffer refers to cheap grace. It's the same kind of thing. There's actual grace, which is costly. And then there's cheap grace. And we need to be able to make that distinction. Sometimes people call it tough love. It doesn't need to be that tough. But love brings with it a kind of, how do I put it? If somebody really loves you, I've had this conversation with my daughter, that it does put pressure on you because you can feel something beautiful and whatever, and it pushes you to want to be better somehow. And you don't have to respond to that, but that's what love does. It kind of puts pressure on you to love back or to accept the love. And so we typically don't talk about what is love, but you're really describing it in loving somebody who's really suffering.
Mm-hmm. And it's because I love you that I want you to live up to the ideals of who you're supposed to be. And people want to hear that. In my experience as a teacher, when I do that, some people really don't want to hear it, and they will turn and go away. Not everybody responds to it. Sadly, there's this sin or vice of acedia, not living up to your best self. There's a lot of people out there who don't want to live up to their best selves. But I've also mentored a lot of people, and I work with students from all kinds of backgrounds. And when I see a student's paper or a student's behavior that's not living up to their best self, I say, you know what? You're capable of much better than this. So why don't you go home and think about who you want to be and what brought you here, and come back tomorrow and you tell me, do you want to be your best self, or do you want to just slide by my class and get a C- or a D? Because you can still graduate with a C- or D, but you come tell me, and if you want, then I'll help you, and I'll help you get better than this failure that you just had. I'm pointing out your mistake, but I'm giving you a way to do better, and I think you're going to be much more satisfied. Now you use your freedom, and you know what? Some of them use their freedom to walk away, and some of them use their freedom to get better. And that's the way it's going to play out in life. That's just the way it is.
Well, it's interesting. What you're talking about is another way of looking at it is mothering and fathering. And you talked about this, that we don't need to be biological parents to be mothers and fathers to people in our lives. And in fact, I would argue that that's how God created us, created women to be mothers and men to be fathers in various ways. And I see that in the lives of the women that I've written about, Mother Teresa, the classic example. We're going to go to a break here. We'll be right back. Final segment with Margarita Mooney. Go to margaritamooney.com. Folks, I am so enjoying this conversation with Margarita Mooney that I don't want it to end, and it doesn't really have to end. It has to end temporarily because you have to come back soon. We've just got a few minutes left today. What about prayer?
I think one thing that I've learned, one of the cardinal sins of being a professor is you think you can sort of talk or reason or logic people to agree with you. And I think the longer I'm a professor and the longer I work with young people, the more I realize that the most important thing I can do is pray for students. And I have to keep my prayer life itself strong. But the temptation is always to want to do more. I'm a doer, That's why I like St. Joan of Arc or Edith Stein. They did great things. And as a young woman, I never really identified with another saint, the mother of Jesus. Her name is Mary, because she didn't do a lot in the world, so it seemed to me. But when I lost my student John Artunian to cancer, believe me, I identified with the suffering mother in the Pietà. And I had told John that if he survived miraculously, we would go to a place where people make pilgrimages to pray in the presence of the Blessed Mother. And after he died, I did that anyway. I went to Fatima, Portugal this summer, and it was so uplifting. And the power of Christian prayer really hits home when you make one of these pilgrimages, because everybody was there with their hopes and their dreams, their sorrows, their longings, people from all over the world speaking all different kinds of languages. And I was sad and I was crying, but I was also being uplifted. And so Christian prayer, for me sometimes, it's sitting and being quiet in my room, but there's a corporal, a communal element of Christian prayer, a visible, public element of Christian prayer. And again, it's not necessarily a prayer of vanquishing all evils in the world. It's a prayer of faith that God is going to vanquish. And being in a place like Fatima really hit that home for me, that Christians need to come together. Yes, pray privately, pray in your room, but we need to pray publicly. I think we need to go back to having these kinds of powerful public street kinds of pilgrimages.
Oh, I love it. I mean, I think I agree with that. I think that's very important.
And it's a tangible, material expression of the eternal reality to which we're all headed. And in my grief, that was so comforting. And I think students, young people who may be lost, who may not open up a Bible or open up one of your books or one of my books, take them on one of these experiences, because the experience rivets them. And then their souls are hungry and they're looking for more, and they're asking the big questions, and they have the courage to see where seeking the truth might lead them.
There's so many resources. When I was at Yale and in the years after, before I found God or before he found me, I didn't even know that there were people of any appreciable intellect or learning who believed in the God of the Bible. I didn't know about the many books and the many figures in history. And once you begin realizing how many people and how many books there are as resources, you think, my goodness, the evidence really is on the side that the God of the Bible is real, that he loves me, that he died for me. The evidence is on that side. We're out of time, Margarita Mooney. I've enjoyed this, as I'm sure you can tell, and we have to have you back as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.